Hi everyone, welcome to Toronto Data Workshop. Our guest today is Annie Collins from GivingTuesday, and she's going to be talking about leveraging data for generosity, GivingPulse, and the GivingTuesday data commons. So Annie is a data scientist at GivingTuesday, which is a US-based nonprofit. They focus on researching generosity and charitable giving behaviors. Outside of GivingTuesday, Annie spent several years in data management and research roles within the Canadian nonprofit sector. She holds a Bachelors of Science in Applied Mathematics and Statistics from the University of Toronto, and she uses her experience to provide data for the public good and support a more data-driven social sector worldwide. Beyond all of that, she's just a very nice person and also super smart. So very much looking forward to this talk. Thank you, Annie.
Thank you, Rohan, for that intro. Rohan and I have known each other for a couple of years, and he's tried to get rid of me many times, but unfortunately, I'm still here. So now you all will be subjected to me as well. Just going to get my screen going. Should have done this ahead of time. You all see that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. Thank you to Rohan for the intro and for having me at the Toronto Data Workshop. So this is going to be a little bit of a different talk than what you might be used to at the Toronto Data Workshop if you've been here a couple times, because I wanted to take this opportunity to talk a bit about my organization and also the nonprofit sector as a whole before getting into an actual project or data set that I work on and talking about some more actual data sciencey and statsy things. So I think data work and research in the nonprofit sector specifically often goes overlooked. And so I hope you'll indulge me and be patient if this is not as interesting to you as I talk a bit at a more of a high level about some of my experience in the field and some of the other work that my colleagues are doing that might be of interest to any more nonprofit folks that are here. So that'll be a bit of a background section, and then I'll discuss one of the main projects that I work on, which is called GivingPulse, which is a weekly cross-sectional survey that's been in the field for a couple of years, and I think is a really interesting data set and analysis project, and is also a completely open data set for anyone here that might be interested in that sort of thing. You see my slides change?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so data in the nonprofit sector. What's going on? Where are we at right now? What's sort of the background for the type of stuff that I do? So spoiler alert, it's not necessarily all positive. We're going to start with some negative and some sort of complaints and critiques and issues in the social sector as it relates to data. So one of the main ones that I think you'll hear a lot is data availability. So oftentimes the data sources that are used for nonprofit and social sector work are government or admin data, or sometimes if you need money, it requires resources and money to generate, and oftentimes those things are not as available to nonprofits as they are to other sectors. So some examples of these challenges with admin data are things like using tax data from the CRA. So at a previous role, I was using T3010 data, which is tax data that nonprofits in Canada file, and that was available to us via CD only. And so I had to go into the office and receive a CD in the mail and then ingest it into the computer using the CD drive, which I didn't have on my laptop. And, there's a huge time delay with that. And it's very inconvenient to have to access giant data sets on a CD. And in the US, there's similar access issues with sort of the equivalent data source, which is the Form 990. So that's the tax form that US 501c3 orgs file. And the Form 990 is, of course, due a couple months after the end of the fiscal year. These forms are theoretically public access and available to the general public for access. However, there is currently, I believe, a few years of delay between when an organization files that form and when it is released by the IRS for public consumption. So not only are you looking at like an organization is filing its taxes after the fiscal year is done, but then you're looking like 2 years later at data for, 2020 data was released in 2023 or earlier this year in 2024. So it's a huge lagging indicator, even when you can't get access to it. And it's like a very unstructured and difficult to access data set in general, despite the fact that it's one of the most important for informing the sector. And even when you can get access in general to these types of data sets, It's often very messy or fragmented across different platforms, so it's really hard to get an idea of the whole picture at a national or regional or subsector level. So like think of how many donation platforms exist, for example. So to understand the state of individual monetary giving to nonprofits, you have to access a lot of different data that's sort of siloed from different providers, different companies, different organizations, things like that. So even when you get access to data, data communication is another issue. So where there's data being produced and research being done, it's sometimes hard to get that research into the hands of people who could actually use it. So for example, like executive leadership teams, or even sometimes fundraisers who are working more quote unquote on the ground. And it's also sometimes hard to convince people to believe novel or unexpected results. So anecdotally, lots of fundraisers or nonprofit leadership who have been working in the field for years and years and years have, tried and true experiences with their practice. And sometimes if you're presenting something novel that's maybe a bit more experimental, people are resistant to the sort of uptake and implementation of those kinds of results. And that's when data is effectively communicated, which as data scientists and researchers, we have a responsibility to do. And I think there's a bit of a disconnect on our end as well in terms of making that research accessible. And finally, resource scarcity. So few nonprofits are able to have data-focused or research-focused staff in-house. And it's often not a super high priority for a lot of nonprofits, specifically smaller organizations, lower capacity organizations, or those whose resources are focused on frontline assistance. So data and data-related products can be an afterthought, and potentially useful data, such as CRM or internal data that is already in-house, may go unutilized because there's no one who can analyze it or has capacity to analyze it. And I think this relates to the data communication issue as well, because when people who do have data that might be useful potentially don't communicate it effectively, this resource scarcity or lower capacity organizations still have issues accessing that type of research. So in comparison with other sectors, obviously in the private sector, there's more resources, but it's also potentially less collaborative and there's less consolidation of data from different sources because there's that element of competition. And looking at academia, I think academia balances some of these issues in terms of like resources and collaboration, but there's, again, often going back to that gap sector due to lack of effective communication or hesitancy on behalf of practitioners and leadership to take into account more experimental, novel, publishable academic results. So these issues impact nonprofits in terms of their own practices, like internal decision making, making informed and data-driven fundraising practice decisions, for example, but it also impacts the sector's collective ability to advocate for itself when it comes to policy issues, and particularly those that disproportionately impact smaller and lower capacity organizations. So where, the United Way or the YMCA or like World Vision might be able to make a case for itself. Smaller organizations, which are, there are many, many low capacity organizations that you and I don't know about or hear about on a day-to-day who might be disproportionately impacted, are unable to sort of collectively mobilize due to this lack of data access. So that's your rant to start off with. I'm sorry to start off on such a negative note. However, what can we do about this? Is sort of the follow-up question. And that also brings me to the question of what is GivingTuesday and what is the GivingTuesday Data Commons? So taking a bit of a step back, if you've ever heard of GivingTuesday, you are likely thinking about the hashtag GivingTuesday or GivingTuesday the day, which is the Tuesday after American Thanksgiving in late November or early December. And this is a day where people are encouraged to give to charity, are encouraged to participate in generosity and give back to their communities. So you'll often receive many, many emails on this day, either for those of you from U of T, I know I receive lots of U of T emails, or from other charities or organizations that you might be involved in. And it's also, I think, almost always the top trending hashtag on X or Twitter for most of the day. So that's maybe where you've encountered it before. GivingTuesday was initiated in 2012 out of the 92nd Street Y in New York City. And it was sort of fabricated as a response to Black Friday and Cyber Monday. So you've spent Friday and Monday doing all of your consumeristic shopping activities. So how about on the Tuesday, we spend a bit of money putting back into our communities and towards charity. And it has gradually grown over the past 12 years, I guess, now. And last year for GivingTuesday 2023, the total value of monetary donations given on GivingTuesday was estimated at $3.1 billion in the US. on the day, and that brought us to a cumulative $13 billion raised on Giving Tuesday since 2012. And these numbers are only for the US and only for monetary contributions made on the day of Giving Tuesday. So it doesn't count volunteer hours, in-kind donations, or other forms of participation like social media discussion or advocacy or things like that. So that's the background on sort of the day of Giving Tuesday, the social movement. And in 2019, Giving Tuesday became its own registered organization in the US. And the organization works to support the social movement on the day, but also year round, and foster generosity in all its forms through various projects and programming. It's grown far beyond the US. We have staff globally and leaders globally and participation globally as well. So yeah, it's grown quite a bit in the past 12 years. And within Giving Tuesday, the organization, there is a programs team, like a more typical nonprofit-y type people. And then there's also a separate data-focused team that takes care of the research and data-focused projects and infrastructure projects. And the data team, which I am a part of, operates a lot on its own, but we also provide support to members of the broader organization and the broader volunteer and participant network as well. So like I mentioned, Giving Tuesday is a global movement. We have people all over the world. Our data programs, we do have global data programs as well, some of which we operate within the data commons in the US, and some are sort of independent within hubs around the world. I will be focusing specifically on North America and specifically on US data today. So just for your consideration. All right, so the Giving Tuesday Data Commons. This is a bit of our jargony manifesto. So I'll start here and then we'll get into the actual, like the data of it all in the next slide. So what is the Giving Tuesday Data Commons? We provide standards and technologies to curate information and data assets, policy and guidelines to drive the use and management of individual data assets, processes and capacities to extract value and knowledge from the infrastructure, and we facilitate partners and communities that contribute to and maintain the systems built. So this is sort of like the definition of what Giving Tuesday Data Commons is and is doing. I imagine, like myself, many of you are data people or data scientists, and this doesn't really mean anything to me in terms of my day-to-day work. So I have distilled this down into this slide, which I hope summarizes things a little bit better for this audience. So the roles that we play are data production and data consolidation. So what that means is, on the data production side of things, we are actually producing ourselves. So the surveys that we undertake are largely surveys that aim to get at informal and non-monetary giving. So information that you kind of have to access via people's own self-report. So we have a couple. One of them is GivingPulse, which I'll be talking about later today. We also have a global annual survey. We run our own survey about Giving Tuesday awareness. So that's really where we're like designing a survey questionnaire, a sampling methodology. We work with a survey provider, and then we're collecting that data and analyzing it in-house. On the data consolidation side of things, this is where we have many external partners that send us their own data, whatever kind of data that might be. Typically, it's transaction data for this type of work. And then we are to sort of join that data together in order to give a better picture of a set of activities or of a specific trend in the nonprofit sector. So an example of this would be the fundraising effectiveness project, where we consolidate individual financial transaction data. So when someone gives money to a nonprofit organization online, there's a record of that transaction. Donation platforms. So like, I guess the most commonly known one might be like something like PayPal, where you are like entering your credit card information and giving money to an organization. So we take that type of transaction data and standardize it, and then we're able to provide an idea of what's going on at a sector level in terms of individual donations to nonprofits better than any one individual platform can do itself. And platforms are sort of hesitant to have that partnership with each other because obviously they're operating with the same sort of client base. And so we act as sort of the go-between and the center point to consolidate that type of data set. Then research and collaboration, these are a little bit more abstract, but basically with the data that we're doing, that we house in-house, we have at least pretty much always like one report that will go out on it. A few of our projects, GivingPulse and the Fundraising Effectiveness Project, we report on quarterly, and then we have a few like one-off things. So that's sort of the research agenda. I don't believe we've published academically anything yet. That's sort of something that we've been trying to get on the horizon, but we self-publish a lot of our reports and we'll collaborate with think tanks and other organizations for things like that. And then the club obviously factors into every other role that we play. But we will also do sort of research on behalf of other organizations, or we'll field data requests from the media or from the more nonprofit colleagues on the program side to support something like a presentation or a slide deck, or if they're working with someone in the field who wants to know something about, hey, like what is the trend of recurring donors in the US right now? We have data on that. And so we're able to provide some sort of one-off reporting and requests in a collaborative way. And we have people on the team who foster the networks and our relationships with external people in an ongoing manner. So it's really a collaborative venture. So sort of like I mentioned previously, the types of data that we work with are surveys. We have financial transaction data. We work with admin and tax data, so that Form 990 data set. I don't think we've done any specific research on the Form 990 data, but we're working more on the infrastructure side of things with that right now to make it more accessible and standardized. And then also internally, we work with some of our own CRM data and network data to sort of get an understanding of what Giving Tuesday means and who is involved and the connections between people in the movement, because that's a bit of an abstract thing that we're trying to measure right now. And then as far as tools go, all of our analysis on the data science side of things is done in Python. And then we also use SQL to query some of our larger databases. All of our data is housed in Databricks, and that's also where we do all of our computing and coding analysis. Our data viz platform is called Mode, and that also runs off SQL, and we query directly from Databricks in order to do our dashboarding and data viz type activities. I gave this presentation one time to a group of students who then proceeded to only ask me about the tools that we use during the Q&A. We have a dedicated data engineering team, and so I'm very privileged to not think about these tools very often and just focus on the sort of research questions. So if you have questions about sort of our tech stack and things like that, I will do my best to answer them, but I'll be very scared, and I will probably refer you to one of our data engineers. So just keep that in mind. This is not my area of expertise. Our data scientists, there's six data scientists and 3 data engineers, and the data scientists focus more on basically being like quantitative social scientists or quantitative like economics researchers, and focus a little bit less on the engineering ingestion pipeline type of work. So as an overview of some of our projects, I've touched on a couple of these already. GivingPulse is the one I'll be discussing, so I won't get too into that. Our 990 data infrastructure project is also, I mentioned in passing, so we're working at consolidating 990 data, this tax form data that has been disseminated by many different groups and organizations, and we're trying to get everyone sort of on board and to house that data in-house and give researchers easier and more secure access to that. One thing that I haven't really mentioned is that we also facilitate working groups at the Data Commons. And so these are groups of people that are like open, anyone can sign up basically, to just like discuss and learn and ask questions and support each other as it relates to a specific topic. So the Generosity AI working group is actually quite large. So it's a bit of a beast in its own right. I think it's a couple hundred people now. But that just launched last year, and one of the main things that they are working on is forming a problem library. I think the nonprofit sector is a little bit more hesitant than some private sector institutions on the uptake of AI, and so it's sort of a place where people can come and ask their questions and bounce off each other to sort of discuss developments in the AI and generosity space. The Growing Generosity in Florida report is an example of something we've done in collaboration with another organization. So this was funded by the Jesse Ball DuPont Fund, and we were working with the Florida Nonprofit Alliance to get an idea of generosity trends specifically in Florida. This one's interesting because we're sort of undergoing a part 2 of this project, where we did some clustering analysis for the report and found some sort of distinct behavioral subgroups of Florida nonprofit donors. Now we're working with nonprofits to deploy A/B testing to see if those, if and to what extent those profiles that we've generated do exist in reality and in people's donor bases, and how well donors respond to that sort of survey-based research that we've done. The fundraising effectiveness project I've mentioned. The Giving Bridge is our look back report. So basically like our annual research report. It's one of our only reports or projects that covers international data sources. So if you're interested in anything that I'm talking about today, I mean, I'd encourage you to look at GivingPulse, all of our assets related to that. But the look back report is, if you Google Giving Tuesday look back report, you'll find the website. That's a good sort of overview of like the types of research questions that we're asking and the types of data we have in house, because that's our like one big annual report. And then the National Study on Donor Advised Funds is an interesting one. If you know about donor advised funds or care about them at all, they're kind of an interesting financial vehicle that's emerging in the nonprofit sector over the past couple of years. And this was one of those projects where we basically got a bunch of data from individual providers and worked on ingesting it. It was like some of these files were like Word docs that like Janice, the fund administrator, had just been like noting stuff down in on her own accord over the years. And so it was like this mass ingestion of all these different types of files and trying to consolidate and standardize everything. And then that data set was handed over to the Donor Advised Funds Research Collaborative, who is a group of academics who wrote this report. So that was one where we were handling more of like only the data side, less of the analysis side. But it's a very interesting report. And if you care about that sort of thing, I would highly recommend you check it out. All right, so that was my organizational nonprofit wide manifesto. And now I will talk to you actually about some data and product and research that I work on. So GivingPulse, that's sort of my main project at Giving Tuesday. Like I mentioned previously, GivingPulse is a weekly survey, and it's designed to investigate a broad range of giving behaviors and sentiments. Survey responses provide insights into the state of generosity and allow the sector to explore how various events, interventions, crises, demographic factors, how they impact or correlate with generosity. And this survey is in the field weekly. It's in the field now. So we're basically constantly getting data and constantly able to provide updates and new insights from the survey. This is a Giving Tuesday Data Commons project, and it was funded by the Fidelity Charitable Catalyst Fund for the past couple of years to get us started on this. So there's two main goals of GivingPulse as a project. The first is the sort of timely weekly nature of it. So to gather timely insights about generosity and to be able to provide like almost real-time updates on generosity and trends and reactions to real-world events. So unlike other longitudinal studies, GivingPulse is also a cross-sectional survey. It's not a panel survey, which is there's a few sort of ongoing panel studies in the US nonprofit sector, but this is a different group of people every week. So it really allows us to get an idea of like what is going on in the world of generosity at any given time. The second goal is a little bit more abstract, and that is to measure generosity broadly and holistically. So oftentimes we think of philanthropy in terms of monetary donations to registered nonprofit organizations, because that is an easy thing to get data on, because there's obviously records of every time there's a financial transaction made. But in GivingPulse, we aim to go beyond this view that we find to be slightly more restrictive and to capture a wider range of giving behaviors. So that's sort of the theory behind things. And from a data and analysis perspective, as you know, this project has gone on, we are aiming to establish baselines and to be able to assess when there are shifts or longer term trends or shorter term sort of blips and changes in any of the metrics that we have, you know, time series data for. And then also, in addition to this sort of weekly time series analysis approach, another thing that we have working to our advantage is that we're accumulating quite a large sample size over time because, you know, we're getting new respondents every week. And so we can actually ask like some pretty in-depth research questions or respond to more in-depth research questions about how and why different subgroups of people give because we have quite a lot of like drill down capacity with the sample size that we have. And it's constantly growing as well. So when I'm talking about measuring generosity holistically, this is sort of an overview of what is actually in the questionnaire. It's quite a long questionnaire. And the giving taxonomy is how we approach asking about generosity in, I believe, all of Giving Tuesday's surveys that we run. So not just GivingPulse, some of our other programs as well. So when we are looking at the type of gift that people give, we are asking about 4 different gift types, and those are money, items, or in-kind donations, so like things like food and clothing, time or volunteerism, And finally, advocacy, or giving voice to a cause or an individual. So those are our 4 gift types. And then as far as recipient types go, we have registered nonprofit organizations. So in the US, this is your 501c3 registered organization. We also have informal groups. So this is something that is basically any type of giving that occurs in a group setting that isn't to a formal organization. So this is things like giving circles, giving to a social movement, so something like Black Lives Matter, might be giving to a crowdfunding campaign that impacts a group of people, or to something like a community sports team that is just sort of an informal grouping of people. And then finally, we ask about individual giving. So giving to a non-family community member or friend. So helping out a neighbor or something like that. So with these 4 gift types and 3 recipient types, we have this 12-part question that sort of forms the backbone of our questionnaire. And then the rest of the questions are about the sort of how and why of these giving behaviors. So people's responses to this first set of questions. We also have a sort of catch-all other gift type, and we're currently asking about political donations as well, as we approach the American election in November. So we've been asking that for a couple of months. So the backbone is these 12 questions, but then we've had a few that have sort of popped in and out of this section. And now to the remainder of the questionnaire. So like I mentioned, sort of the rest of the questions relate back to people's responses to that first set of questions. So if you have given in some or any form, we ask about the causes that you gave to, the methods that you used to donate. So did you donate online? Did you give cash to a person? Did you round up at a cashier? Things like that. We ask about decision spontaneity. Did you plan in advance or did you decide in the moment to give? We ask about solicitation. Have you been solicited recently? If you were, how did you respond? Have you responded or have you not responded? We ask about crisis awareness, both in terms of like overall awareness and specific crises that people are aware of. And then, of course, their generous response to that if they did or did not do anything in response. And we ask about specific types of giving, like workplace giving and recurring giving, and things like that. And then moving on from the behavioral side of things, we also ask a suite of attitudes questions. So people's motivations for giving, attitudes about the nonprofit sector, and attitudes about generosity or pro-sociality in general. We ask people about what they intend to do in the future. And then we also, I want to say recently, but it's been almost a year now, have been asking, instead of asking people to identify themselves as Republican or Democrat, we've been asking a 9-part political worldview question that's drawn from the Pew Research Center political typology questionnaire. And we use that to map people to their place on the left-right political spectrum. So that's been a really interesting sort of way at looking at people's attitudes and their related behaviors. And then, of course, we're asking a suite of demographics questions. So age, sex, geography. We, in Q2 of this year, started asking about about people's county of residence. So we have county level data for the past 6 months now, which is kind of cool, in addition to state and regional residency. We ask about people's ethnic identity, religiosity, and we ask about income and also disposable income. So a few different dimensions of income. And these are all sort of, relatively typical demographic cuts. So the GivingPulse sample, it's a US focused program, and more specifically, the sampling frame consists of 18 to 85-year-olds who have been living in the US for the past 12 months, or at least the past 12 months. Respondents are quota sampled from an Ipsos panel, and this is according to the age, sex, and regional distributions from the most recent US Census. And where the quota sampling does not necessarily exactly map up, we employ some small post-stratification weights to calibrate the sample to that census distribution. Like I think I've mentioned already, the sample size for GivingPulse is about 100 respondents weekly. So this is relatively small. So we generally compute weekly metrics on a 4-week rolling basis to get up to like a 400-person sample size. And then at the end of the year, for a period of 10 weeks, we increase our weekly sample size up to 600 people. And that's to better capture behavior relating to GivingTuesday, of course, at the end of November, as well as in general, the year-end giving behaviors, which is pretty much is accepted as a very, very generous time. So that's the reason for the upsample there. So with all that in mind, the typical annual sample size of GivingPulse is about 10,000 people. We began data collection in 2022, and with the upsampling at the end of the year, the current total sample size is about 20,000 respondents, which is quite a large survey data set. I mean, it of course spans 2 years, but that's quite a lot of respondents, so it's quite a large data set. So, questionnaire and data collection. GivingPulse is an online survey. Respondents are recruited online and they respond to the survey online or on mobile as well. Like I previously mentioned, data collection occurs weekly and has been ongoing since February 2022. And a key feature of the GivingPulse questionnaire, a key design component, is that it asks about respondents' behaviors in the past 7 days. So that, we're asking a new set of people every week. And when people are responding, they're asked to report on their past 7 days of behavior. So we should be getting a pretty good idea of what has gone on in any given week that the survey is in the field. However, this was not always the case. When GivingPulse began in February 2022, we were actually asking about the past 4 weeks of behavior. This presented a couple of different problems. And so in September of 2022, we switched to asking about the past 7 days. So that affected most parts of the survey. It didn't affect things like attitudes and demographics and things like that. But we typically would say that the GivingPulse data set is relatively continuous back to September 2022. And then we have some data points that extend the previous 6 months prior to that. There have also been some pretty substantial methodology changes in certain questions since then. So there was a pretty big round of edits last Q4, so Q4 2023. And then we'll cycle questions in and out for certain set periods of time. So it's quite a beast of a survey. Every time we add a new question, the data set expands. But for the most part, we have stuff going back to September 2022. All right, so to give you an idea, now that I've spoken at a very high level, both about the organization and about the project, this is sort of an overview of some results. Now, I will say we report on this quarterly now. We just released our Q2 report last week. So there's not really one set of results or one big paper that we have written about this data set. It's kind of a practice of monitoring what's going on, reporting on shifts and things like that. So this should just give you sort of an overview of the types of things that we report on, the types of one-off analysis that we do. So these are two of our main vizzes. These are time series for overall participation in giving different gift types, and then the aggregated recipient types at the bottom there. So this is coming from that generosity taxonomy question that I showed earlier. So the giving in any form hovers between 60 and 70% in any given week. And you'll also see here, maybe it's a little bit small on your screens, but that purple line is donating items. And that is typically the most popular form of donating by a small margin in any given week. So this is sort of one of those things that we talk about as a motivation for expanding your idea of generosity beyond monetary giving, because when we ask about people's non-monetary behaviors, it actually turns out that more people are giving items than they are actually donating money. And then you'll also see, as I have discussed with that Q4 sort of end of year giving season, as it relates to GivingTuesday and Christmas, you can see the sort of boost in all of these time series happening around November. So you see that sort of little end of year lift, and then it comes down a little bit after that. Looking at recipient types, registered organizations are the most common form of donating, but you also see that registered or unregistered groups and individuals are not so far behind registered organizations. So again, motivation for capturing those additional forms of generosity as well. So this is some of our crisis awareness data. So when we ask about crisis awareness, we ask if people are aware, and then if they say they are aware, there's an open text field for people to say what crises they are aware of. And so with some natural language processing and quite a lot of admittedly manual overrides for some bad spelling, we get like this, which I think is really cool. I think it's really cool to see exactly what people are thinking about, and also just this is a very pretty visualization. So this is Q2 2023 to Q2 2024. You'll see some of these big spikes. This gray is the overall crisis awareness. This purple spike in last September is the wildfires in Hawaii. So this is the word fire. One of the cool things we saw with this most recent Q2 is this tornado, the word tornado is showing up. A lot, it was the most common word in Q2 for the Midwest tornado season, but you also see almost exactly the same magnitude of awareness at the exact same time last year. So we're observing some seasonality in this crisis data, which is very validating and cool to look at. And then you can also see things like the Israel-Hamas war in November, and then sort of looking at how where the peak of that occurs and how it has been sort of sustained over time since October and November of last year. So things like this I think are really cool. It's again, a hard question to data or to analyze with it being like a relatively short open text response. But I think it's really cool. And it also allows us to look at not just are you aware of a crisis and what did you do, but sort of like what crisis are you aware of and how does that impact your behavior? So we can also see like, for example, people who are aware of the who reported awareness of a tornado in this past quarter were much more likely to give at a national scope instead of just locally. So data points like that are really cool to see via this crisis data. So getting into some of the more advanced analysis approaches, this is not like super advanced stuff, but maybe a bit more advanced than just plotting a time series. We also do some clustering analysis every quarter on this data set, and this is in order to generate these what we call generosity profiles, which are groups of types of donors within the data set. And we do this to get a more sort of holistic view as to what motivates donors to give and what types of people are engaging in what type of behavior, instead of just looking at like old versus young, high income versus low income, informal versus formal, and things like that. So when we do this, we get a pretty stable behavioral profile from quarter to quarter. And we get three clusters. And the first one is the low activity cluster. These are people who are relatively unengaged from the nonprofit sector. They don't enjoy giving to nonprofits. They're the least likely to trust nonprofits, and they're the least pro-social. And they typically are lower income and less religious than other people in the sample. Then cluster two is our activated group. These people are sort of mid-level generosity. This is typically the largest subset of the sample. So in Q2, it was 44%. The attitudinally, even though these people are mid-level generosity, they're the most intrinsically motivated to give. They feel the most pro-social, and they generally feel very positive and trusting towards nonprofits. And they have a relatively average demographic composition. And then our cluster three is our smallest, and this is our dedicated group of givers. These are frequent, highly generous givers in all categories. They are the most likely to report giving due to peer pressure or guilt. So they have relatively high levels of prosociality, but they also are very clearly motivated by these sort of more negative push factors. And demographically, they're sort of an outlier. They're the youngest, they're the most religious, they're the highest income, and they're also majority male. So kind of an interesting demographic composition there. But again, we do observe this quarter to quarter that the types of people that show up with this like very high level of generosity with these like negative motivations are this younger male component of our sample. So it's kind of interesting. So like I mentioned, these are the stable factors, but then also given the fact that we have some things that are stable quarter to quarter, it's also interesting to see how different things change quarter to quarter. So for example, in Q2, we observed that there was a 6% point drop in solicitation overall, like when we looked at the whole sample. And then when we looked at the generosity profiles, we observed that each group individually also had a 5 to 6% point drop in solicitations. So it appears as though people of all levels of generosity and attitudes were solicited less. This wasn't like a specific targeted drop by the nonprofit sector, for example. And then on the other hand, we also observed that in this activated group, volunteering and advocacy were up 17%, even though we didn't observe an increase in the overall sample. So that sort of gets us thinking about like, okay, even though people overall were sort of stable in their volunteering behaviors, this core group of medium generosity people who are maybe not so typically involved in volunteering were more activated this quarter. So what's going on there? Like, why is this type of person more activated in their volunteerism than they have been in previous quarters? So it's sort of like a way that we think about and segment the data beyond just our typical, age, income, religiosity cross sections. And then finally, a lot of the work that we do at GivingTuesday in general, but specifically with GivingPulse, relates to solicitation and response. So that's sort of a lot of what the sector talks about, but it's specifically a lot of what we talk about. And one of the big questions, slightly abstract questions, is like, how much should you be asking? Do people get tired of the ask? Like, is there sort of diminishing returns on how much you ask, or how much more response could we expect if charities were to ask people more frequently for money? And so in Q1, we sort of looked at this with the GivingPulse data set, and we used a classification tree on the subset of solicited respondents to see what factors made people more likely to respond. So the respondents within the solicited group, what features did they display? And what we found is that it was mainly pro-sociality and crisis awareness in Q1. So this decision tree is maybe like just a little bit hard to parse on its own, but this blue group here is the people who were more likely to respond or most likely to respond positively to solicitation. And these are people who reported that it was very important to them to give to people in need, who strongly agreed with the statement, I feel everyone has a responsibility to give and help those in need, and who were aware of a new crisis that emerged in the past week. And so using this model, we then, when we were testing it on our test data set, it performed with about 70% accuracy in classifying people who responded to solicitation. And then when we applied it to the unsolicited group of respondents, we found that 9% of the unsolicited group of respondents displayed the same traits as respondents from the solicited group. And so what that tells us is that there is an untapped group of people in that unsolicited group that show traits that make them likely to respond if charities had asked them for money in the past week or the past month. However, 9% is not a very high number. So there's clearly something differentiating attitudinally the group that was solicited from the group that was unsolicited. And so what can we do to either shift those attitudes or to sort of appeal to a different motivating factor to potentially make people in the unsolicited group more likely to respond. Obviously, it's hard to control crisis awareness in the sense that it's hard to control crisis, but some of those pro-social attitudes are maybe things that could be manipulated or could be things that could, people could find ways to identify in subgroups of the population, or potentially pro-sociality isn't the only motivation for giving. Maybe it's something like tapping into an appeal to efficiency or something like that that could motivate this group of people to give. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. I'm going to leave the QR code up here for a second, and there's my email as well. This QR code will direct you to the GivingPulse website. The landing page for that website is the most recent report, so the Q2 report that was released last week. Like I mentioned previously, the data set is completely free to access. So you'll also find a data access request form there where we'll then just give you access to the platform. You have raw data in Excel and SPSS format, as well as a dashboard, access to the full questionnaire, and all previous reports. So it's basically a hub for anything you might be interested in as it relates to this GivingPulse project and the GivingPulse report. And yeah, if you have any email on the screen there as well. So thank you so much for listening. I'd be happy to open it up to questions or discussions or what have you now.
Thank you very much, Annie. Fantastic talk. If anyone has any questions, please raise your hand and I will call on you. Just while people are maybe thinking about it, could you talk a little bit more about what does the pipeline look like for a respondent? Like, how do you identify them? How do they make their way in to be even asked your questions, your survey?
Yeah, so we work with a sort of like partner consultancy organization, and they pull from an Ipsos panel of sort of like people who sign up to take these types of surveys. So people are recruited. I'm not sure how they're recruited to the panel, but people who are already in the panel are emailed directly and recruited specifically to take this questionnaire. And like I mentioned previously, they're quota sampled according to their age, what did I say? Age, location of like where they live in the US. And oh my gosh, I'm forgetting. Age, regional
It was
distribution.
on your slide.
It was on my
You did
slide.
cover it, yeah.
I'm gonna go all the way back. Age, oh my God, age, gender, and US region. So they're quota sampled for that. And then they fill out the survey online from the email. I'm gonna stop sharing my slides now, but I can put the QR code back up if anyone's interested later.
Are there any other questions from folks?
I I have a question if I may. Thank you.
Yeah,
Really great. And I love what
thank you.
the way you presented it too is really very clear and helpful. It's maybe an unfair question, but do you know this it's a lot of stuff that's collected, right? And
Yeah.
I'm wondering, do many charitable organizations do this as well? Is there no, this is
No. Yeah.
Mhm.
So it's quite an intense project. Like running a weekly survey is just like kind of a lot. So there are some like replicated sort of longitudinal, more panel oriented studies that happen at a much lower frequency. So there's one out of the Lilly School of Philanthropy out of Indiana University, which is I think it's the panel study on charitable giving or something like that. But yeah, again, it's a panel, and I think it's yearly that they follow up with respondents there. There was for a period of time, a weekly survey in Canada, but it was a survey of nonprofits, and that was run by a similar institution at Carleton University that focuses on philanthropic giving. But this sort of like individual um, like weekly survey tool asking individuals does not exist as far as we can tell anywhere else in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If anyone has any questions, feel free to raise their hand. But if I'm, maybe I'll just ask one more. If no one else has anything. Oh, Angela, can you detail some of the clustering algorithms that we use on the data? How were those clustering methods selected given this type of data?
Yeah, great question. I should have covered that more in depth, but we use k-means clustering for the data set. We've tried a few different clustering algorithms when we initially were like working on this sort of approach. We tried agglomerative clustering and a couple of density-based methods. We use sklearn, so it was HDB scan and optics. The bottom line is sort of that because we're doing this clustering exercise every quarter, we at the very least needed a clustering algorithm that we could, regardless of performance, like prescriptively like enter the number of clusters that we wanted to see from the data. So k-means is one where you can, test a bunch of different numbers of clusters, but ultimately you have control over the number of clusters you're asking the algorithm to find. And we apply the clustering algorithm to every variable in the data set that relates to behavior. So not to demographics and not to demographics because we are interested in clustering on the things that people can choose or change about themselves and not about their like immutable demographic profile. So that's behaviors and attitudes. And the other thing I'll say about the clustering side of things is that we do sacrifice some performance of the clustering algorithm in order to keep the methodology consistent quarter to quarter. So we cluster on the same variables and we use the same, barring like a huge shift in performance of the algorithm, which would require us to, sort of reshape how we look at things. We keep the methodology consistent quarter to quarter. And we've observed, like I mentioned, some things that are consistent each time and some things that change quarter to quarter. So yeah, does that answer your question? Cool.
Are there any other questions from folks? Oh, Maria.
Hey Annie, great talk. I was wondering if I can ask you some questions about the data.
Mhm.
Um, so maybe I didn't understand, but you mentioned like the respondents are recruited in a panel, and I'm guessing somebody else is doing that. There's like a third party.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about? So I don't quite understand how this recruitment and panel really works. Do you know anything about like response rates, or do you see people repeat in like weekly surveys? Do you have access to that kind of information?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in terms of repeat respondents, each respondent is assigned a unique identifier. So we are told that in theory, respondents can repeat once a year, but will be excluded from the sampling frame for a year following their initial response. We have only so far observed one repeat respondent in the past couple of years. So there's someone there that's pretty gung-ho on responding to this survey once a year, but that's 1 in 20,000 respondents that has repeated, and we haven't observed any other repeats in terms of identifying respondents via the unique identifier. The response rate is so it's not exactly a response rate that we look at because people are recruited directly. And as far as we are aware from working with the survey provider, it's recorded as a dropout rate. So people who start the survey or who are recruited to take the survey and then don't complete the survey. So we have a 12% dropout rate, which is like, I guess, effectively an 88% response rate, which is like a completely unrealistic thing. But because people have signed up to be part of this survey panel, like of their own free will, it's like a small amount of money for responding to surveys. Because people have signed up to participate, their quote unquote response rate is very high. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Can I ask you a few more questions?
Yes,
I'm
please.
curious about all of this. And so for context, for instance, I was really surprised that you find a consistent 70% of weekly respondents actually saying that they contribute in some form, be it monetary, be it through items, be it through advocacy, whatever. I find that to be a high number. Is that something that surprised you in the result? And do you worry that maybe there's some, I don't want to say non-representativeness in the sample of respondents, but maybe like some self-selection that is happening there in terms of who is joining these panels, and like, is there anything that you can glean around, like what I know that the quota sample kind of you're doing this by age, gender, and region of the US, but it struck me as a pretty high number. I wonder if you have any like insights behind either that, or I'm super cynical and hanging out with the wrong people.
Oh no, hopefully not a bit of both. Yeah, I think that's a fair critique, and that is something that we've heard from other people who work in this space. I think there's sort of a few things that that come to mind in response to that. One is that that overall giving number is taken out of any of the 12 to 14 dimensions of generosity that we're looking at. And in previous like iterations of the survey, for example, like the advocacy question has been like endorsing something on social media. That's a pretty vague thing and a pretty low bar. Like someone could like something on Facebook and then report that they had engaged in advocacy of an organization in the past week, So there's, I think, a lot of things to be said about the self-reported aspect of things, how people are understanding the questions that we ask and interpreting their own behavior in the context of that questions, that I think gives people a lot of opportunity to say that they have participated. The other thing that I think we see is looking at other surveys that are not focused on generosity, but asking a question related to generosity, have much lower report rates. And so I think given the fact that the survey, it doesn't recruit people based on previous giving behavior, like it's very agnostic as to like, we're not recruiting like people from a donor list or like people who have signed up to take a survey specifically about charitable giving, because they're just sort of in this aggregate pool of like panel respondents. But all of the questions basically pretty like explicitly relate to generosity. And so there's this idea of this sort of like snowball effect that as you're going through the survey, you might be like thinking more and more specifically about your generous behavior, and that might lead you to think a certain way. Like that first question is a 12-parter. So like if you're getting repetitively asked in like a randomized order, you're 12 questions in to someone ask you what you've done in the past week, we have been thinking more and more about how to figure out like what that cumulative effect of asking people a bunch of questions about generosity instead of just being like, do you walk to work? Do you like, how many kids do you have living at home? Also, did you give to charity? Also, did you, stuff like that, that sort of sets people up to think that they are potentially more generous than they are being. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I think that answers my question. Great work, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah, there's also, sorry, go ahead.
No, that was it.
Okay. There's also it's very hard because, like I mentioned previously, there's not a lot of weekly data collection or even just like surveying that's done about people's behaviors in the past week. Like a lot of this stuff, even like surveys on this topic will ask about people's behaviors in the past year. And so it's hard to sort of like scale up from the 1 week to like, you know, to look at it. Even if we see like 90% of people did something in the past year and like 70% did something in the past week, like the numbers don't work out. So it's hard to find, like the number seems high, but it's hard to figure out what a more accurate number is. And then also there was a survey done, I think, like by the US Census Bureau that was it was a time use survey that asked people to record exactly how they used, like at half-hour intervals, their day. And that survey was for like a sample of people in 1 day, and it found that 25% of people engaged in volunteering, which like matches our number, which asks about the past week. So there's just like there's a lot of noise, is the sort of TLDR of it. And it's very hard to verify exactly what people mean when they say these kinds of things.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, no worries. Good question.
It's now on the hour, so with that, we might just say thank you very much to Annie once again for a fantastic presentation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. That's great.
If folks want to join next week, we have Sean Taylor from Motif on causal discovery for product analytics. So maybe some crossover in terms of surveys. Anyway, thanks very much for joining, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.